You're nothing but a paycheck, Mark, everyone can see it. Evelyn Bennett said loud enough for the banquet room to tilt toward her. And a ripple of laughter chased the clink of cutlery as my daughter Hannah's face went pale under the chandelier's cheap glow, and strangers turned like weather vanes to watch me buckle. My name is Mark Bennett. I'm 42, from Columbus, Ohio, and I felt my ribs hollow with the sound of their approval for a cruelty dressed as family humor. There was something else too, a cold little advantage tucked like a coin in my back pocket, a paper, a clause, a ledger they'd signed one winter that would not let them call me a debtor without reminding them of their own signatures. But I kept that thought like a match in my fist because you do not light paper in a room full of gas. I'd driven 3 hours to this fundraiser because Hannah had begged me. Dad, please, just come, and because the portrait of them smiling at the dais had always been the image I wanted her to carry, the unbroken picture I wanted to leave in her head of what a family looked like, but the portrait was a lie instead of a frame. People leaned forward. My brother Derek, tall in a suit that fit him like Sunday, wore the kind of embarrassed grin that reads like ownership, and his smile split my mother's face into a map of satisfaction. The MC clapped and called for another toast as if we were at the end of something sacred instead of the beginning of the unraveling, and my chest moved like an engine backfiring. I tasted diner coffee on my tongue from the morning and remembered the chipped blue mug, "Family First," in faded white letters that had been on our kitchen counter every day of childhood like a talisman, the mug they'd hand Derek when he cried after a bad game while they said, "It's his time," and slide it past me with a cool passing hand when I asked for help with tuition. The mug was small, banal, perfect, a symbol they'd never noticed I was watching. I heard Hannah's chair scrape, and she said nothing. My father Robert's laugh ate the silence, and someone behind me whistled like a dog. I wanted to stand and set the room right with a truth, any truth that would make them remember what they paid me for. But I also wanted to protect Hannah's gaze from the way her grandfather had made me small, and the desire to shield her tightened like a noose around the next words that might come out of my mouth. I felt old in that moment, older than 42, because time is the accountant that always lists you last. Before I could decide whether to laugh or leave, Derek leaned into the circle of approving faces and spat the rhythm of entitlement. Mark's always been the generous one. He pays for things, so he gets opinions, right? Someone laughed louder and my hands found the edge of my chair. The insult landed, a practiced throw, and everywhere people shifted. A waiter paused mid-step with a tray balanced like a secret. I could feel, beneath the insult, the thrum of opportunity, the small paper advantage again, the ledger, the signature that existed in a desk drawer at 2 a.m, the clause about respectful conduct tied to the loans I'd made on their behalf when their mortgage gap was 6 months and their pride too big. I had the quiet record of my labor that could be read like a contract and weaponized when words weren't enough. My pulse measured time in small, equal beats, and I left the table before the applause finished and stepped into the cold Columbus night with the air punching the lungs like a hand. Hannah followed me outside on instinct, coat collars up, breath fogging between us, and for a second the world narrowed down to her and the stone steps. I could smell bar grease from a late-night grill down the block, the honest smell of the city that had taught me to grind, and I thought, if they were going to make me a joke in public, they had handed me my only audience. I leaned my forehead against the stone arch and felt the grit there, and then I remembered the tiny, stupid thing that had always steadied me, the chipped blue mug from that diner, in the attic now, with its ring of dried coffee on the inside like a map of small, unpaid devotion, an ordinary relic I kept because it smelled like mornings when no one else could be counted on. It had been with me through layoffs and overtime and nights in cheap motels when I drove between jobs, and its rim had once held a folded promissory note they'd signed because they'd promised they'd never treat me like a bank if I helped them out. The memory of the signature was a hot coal in my pocket that I did not drop. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. The sentence felt absurd in the hush between Hannah's breath and my father's laugh, like a glove on a hand that wasn't mine. But once it left my mouth, it drew a line. People stared because a private plea spoken into a public place is always half performance. She touched my arm, light as a thought, and said, "Dad, are you okay?" With a voice that worried I might fall apart. The answer wasn't simple. The room had already decided for me that I was the dutiful checkbook and nothing more. I looked at her, at the way her lip trembled into a question that asked for a version of me not breaking, and in the reflection of the glass door behind us, I glimpsed my own face like a print on a window, half clear, half smudged. I told her, voice even, because evenness is a kind of armor, but I'm not staying for their applause. I thought of the seasons of dinners where I had paid for more than food, car repairs, prescription copays, a down payment on a roof, and how they'd never once called it generosity. They'd called it help and nothing more, as if continuity absolved guilt. The mug was a detail in all of this, and a promise folded into the footnotes. It mattered because they believed small things never spoke. "If you need anything, I'll come get you," I said, and she shook her head. She wanted to go back in for a moment to stand beside her grandparents, to remember them as the forces they had always been in her life, not to be witnesses to my humiliation. That desire in her made me angrier than the insult. I had been trying to build a fortress around her, and they had been using the mortar as currency. I walked to my truck under the sodium light, and the leather of the steering wheel was familiar and cold. I drove for 30 minutes without a map, hands knotted on the wheel, and every red light clicked like a metronome counting out a new rhythm. The room, the laughter, the little blue mug. I told myself I would be quiet about it for a week. Silence would teach them the value of absence. The plan felt thin as a receipt, but receipts are records, and records can be hard. Sometimes the ledger remembers what the heart forgets, I thought, and the thought was a line I would come back to when the ledger raised its head. The next morning I opened the attic box, and there it was. The chipped blue mug with its familiar chip at the lip, and on the inside the faint brown ring of the coffee I'd never changed. Tucked under a napkin was the yellowed promissory note. Their names and Robert's careful, looping script and Evelyn's quick, impatient hand. Terms about repayment, yes, but also a clause about public commentary and mutual respect, written when I was naive enough to think a signature could make them keep their mouths. I held the paper and felt a tide lift in me that had nothing to do with pride. It was the tide of leverage. I called Carla Romero, a lawyer friend who owed me a favor from years ago when I clerked for her at a small courthouse, and she had once loaned me a dryer while my rent checks caught up, and I told her, "Read this and tell me if my mother can say I'm a paycheck in public." She laughed at first, because people laugh at small revenge plans, and then she told me, "There's a clause here about public disparagement tied to the loans. You might have more than pride if you play it right." The laugh was the kind of sound that pivots toward validation, and it sent a clean, violent pleasure through me. The clean part was the law, black on white, and violent was how right it felt that the signatures might bite back. There was a darkness, too, a recognition of how much I had already given away to be the safety net. The cars, the unpaid overtime, the calls at midnight, that ledger of labor was not sentimental, it was a list. When I placed the mug back in the box, I said to myself the thing that made me step fully into a plan. You can either be the background in their photos, or you can be the reason the frame falls apart. That was not a comfort. It was a starting point, and it smelled faintly of burnt coffee and revenge. A man who forgets his own worth will always be on someone else's tab, I whispered to myself, and it was the first of the lines that kept coming, manifesting like a stubborn chorus when I needed courage. I started drafting an email that night, a calm, factual note asking for a meeting to discuss the terms of our financial arrangements. And in the subject line, I wrote something bureaucratic because formality hides teeth. Review and reconciliation, Bennett Family Loans. I attached a scanned copy of the promissory note and hit send to Evelyn and Robert, and to Derek with the same coolness he'd used on the dais. Their responses were immediate and thin. Amusement, a patronizing, "We'll discuss it." Derek's single-word emoji that read like a shrug, and then a text from Evelyn that said simply, "Mark, you wound us." I printed the thread, put it in a folder, and for 3 nights I checked my daughter sleeping and rehearsed calm speeches until even the silence in my house sounded like preparation. I did not tell Hannah the shape my plan might take because I wanted her to keep the memory of her grandparents unassailable for as long as possible. I wanted only to erode their power where it mattered. I began to post small things online. Not about them. Never about them. I posted about carpools and coffee and the aches of 42-year-old knees and the little victories of making payroll at my small contracting business. And I watched, privately, how the world responded to an honest man in search of ordinary dignity. The audience was small at first, but honest people gather like moths around light. Their laughter at the banquet had been a public record. It would be a public record undone, but the undoing required patience, the thing I'd always had in spades because sacrifice is measured in years, not hours. I set the box containing the mug and the note on top of the dresser where Hannah would see it if she ever went looking for it, and then I began to move like someone setting a trap that was legal and therefore inevitable, a trap that leaned on signatures and receipts and the stubborn authority of contracts. I would need a friend who could publish things without sensationalism, a person with access to a small but serious newsroom, and I thought of Olivia Park, the reporter who had once covered a local corruption story and had called me in for coffee to ask about groundwork. She had an eye for truth and the kind of patient curiosity that could make a small story large. The plan was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was an insistence that debts be acknowledged in the ways that mattered, legally, publicly, and in a ledger where signatures are louder than apologies, and somewhere under all that was the hope that doing this would make Hannah stop thinking that her father was only a source of funding and nothing of worth. I slept like a man waiting for a train that would change his route, and when I woke I had an email from Derek with 3 words. Let's talk Monday. The line was bait. The next move belonged to me, and I sharpened it in my mouth like a bitter pill, thinking how weapons sometimes come in thin paper envelopes with signatures. So when Derek said, "Let's talk Monday," I heard the squeak of a hinge that had been oiled for years, and I knew exactly which door it would open. We met in a small conference room above a dentist's office because Derek wanted neutral ground, and the fluorescent light made both of us look confessing. He came in with the practiced posture of someone who expects negotiation to be a buffet and who thought kindness was the same as leverage. He smiled like he was gifting me a chance to save face, a patronizing tilt that had always come free with his charm. I told him calmly that I wanted to reconcile the loans and discuss public comments. He tapped his watch and said, "Is this about the gala?" In the tone of a man who thinks a gala is a costume change. I slid the scanned promissory note across the table, watching the line of his jaw like a reaction shot in a movie, and I felt the small electric thrill of the law's bluntness. Names, dates, and the clause about public disparagement resulting from familial financial arrangements, spelled out in tidy, lawyerish language. Derek's hand hovered over the paper like someone deciding whether to pick up a live wire. He covered it with his palm as if to suppress the truth. "You shouldn't have made this public," he said, meaning my email, meaning the scan, meaning my calm. I told him that I hadn't made it public yet, but that I had friends who did things with facts, and that if he chose insult over settlement, the facts would find their way into places worse than his ego. He chuckled and said, "You think a piece in the paper will change anything?" And the laugh sounded smaller than it used to. The bargaining began like all bargains do, with the louder party assuming the center of the room, and I was conscious the whole time of Hannah sitting in the backseat of my life, watching me choose whether to be the man who raises his voice or the man who finds the rulebook. I had Carla on the phone that afternoon. She told me quietly that the clause could trigger liquidated damages if a public disparagement caused reputational harm, and that her firm would help draft a demand letter ready to file. "We can make the ledger enforceable," she said. It felt almost obscene to weaponize kindness, but kindness had been weaponized against me for decades. The ledger was simply a mirror. I met Olivia in a coffee shop with mismatched chairs and a local election poster peeling on the wall. She listened to the facts and asked for the paper. She had that look reporters get when they smell a pattern less smoke than a trail, and I could tell she was thinking about structure and timing. "If this is handled well," she said, stirring her coffee, "it won't be a smear. It'll be a documented story about family finances and how power looks in small towns." Her calm changed the pitch of the plan from vindictive to necessary. She knew how to put facts where they would bite, not slash. I told her I didn't want spectacle. I wanted truth with teeth. We agreed on a timeline. Olivia would verify the document, interview sources who had been at the banquet, and prepare a piece that emphasized the contractual language and the culture that let the joke happen. I handed her the audio clip the bartender had recorded. Someone had uploaded it because the insult was the kind of thing a stranger thinks is worth capturing, and she listened with the same steady face she used to read depositions. It was muffled through applause but clear. Evelyn's voice, bright, "You're nothing but a paycheck," and the laugh that followed like applause for a punchline. In a different life that might have been a family anecdote. In mine it was evidence. Olivia's newsroom was small but precise. She held off sensational tweets and instead prepared a piece that threaded the promissory note with the audio and the text responses that showed Evelyn's "You wound us" and Derek's emoji shrug. We plan to publish everything at once. The promissory note scanned, the banquet audio embedded, and a clean human story about the cost of being the sibling who held the family afloat. Posting it would be legal, public, and humiliating in the calibrated, unavoidable way only the internet can be. I told myself it was necessary for Hannah to see that the ledger of her life had receipts, that being the family doer was not invisible in the eyes of the law. Carla drafted the demand letter that evening that would accompany the story. A notice of breach and a request for a public apology before formal damages were sought. The letter used small, precise language to be devastating because contracts are often devastating when read slowly. Meanwhile, I kept my social feed the same photos of my truck at work sites, a coffee mug with a cracked rim, jokes about being a 40-something who still could lift a drywall sheet. People responded with warmth. Strangers messaged about their own fathers, their own dinners. There was an audience of ordinary people who recognized the threat of sacrifice in my posts and who were quietly in my corner. I didn't recruit them. They came because honesty attracts company the way light attracts moths. When Olivia's piece dropped, it landed like a stone in a pond. The ripple was immediate. Local commenters who had once called me Quiet Mark started posting, remembering dinners and favors and the nights their neighbor had helped when he was down. The story was measured and fair, and it included the promissory note as an artifact. They could see the signatures, the clause, the dates. Derek's employer called him 3 hours after the piece went live. The HR department asked pointed questions about his judgment, because professional companies do not love public family scandals that hint at entitlement. Derek texted me a flurry. What did you do? Then this is a low blow, and finally Mom is on the phone. Evelyn posted a status that read like a refusal to admit harm, family fights in private. And in the thread, someone posted a video clip from the banquet, filmed by an intern who had uploaded it to a public feed. The clip had already been shared and downloaded. Social platforms preserve everything in the way barns preserve old tools. Suddenly, the audio clip I had given Olivia was viral, and the banquet angle dominated the comments. People who had once smiled politely now wrote scathing replies about hypocrisy. The procedural part, the promissory note clause, began to do the work of law and reputation together. A lawyer called Derek's firm to warn them of possible fallout, and 2 parishioners at the church where Derek coached youth soccer posted that they'd had secondhand stories about his entitlement. Someone dug up a photo essay of Derek at charity galas, and the juxtaposition of PR and private words opened a seam. My phone buzzed with messages. Hannah texted, "Dad, are you okay? They're saying terrible things about you," and her worry stung. I wanted her to see the public version. I wanted her to watch the ledger speak, but I also wanted to protect her from the cruelty of riffraff. I replied, "Watch the piece I sent you. Read the note. Then tell me what you think." She read it on the porch that night with the porch light casting a soft cone over her knees, and when she looked up, she said, "I didn't know." Her voice carried both innocence and the new gravity of an adult making a decision about her parents. The first quotable line of this section rose up then unbidden. "Justice sometimes wears a work shirt and shows up at someone's front step asking for receipts," I said, and the line felt true in my mouth playing, earned. From then on, the pressure mounted in technical ways. Creditors began to ask questions about the source of family loans when Derek's tax preparer flagged odd reimbursements. The promissory note became a pivot in a procedural dance where the small details, dates, signatures, the phrase mutual respect, weren't sentimental but combustible. Evelyn texted a recording of her own. "He just needed boundaries," and I forwarded it to Carla with the note. "This is binding according to Clause 4. Carla responded with a terse, "We can move." Derek tried a countermove. He claimed the promissory note was signed under duress, that the pressures of the time meant my parents had felt coerced. An absurdity dressed in legalese. But Carla found an email trail where my mother had thanked me for helping with the down payment and had signed the note as proof of gratitude. Reciprocity documented. The counterclaim fizzled because contract law is a ledger that favors contemporaneous records over later regrets. It was technical and precise. It was the kind of thing that collapses arrogance when arrogance has no paperwork to back it. Meanwhile, someone in the town's comment threads posted a screenshot of a private message Evelyn had sent to a neighbor calling my help an annoying tax, and it spread like a rumor made official. Digital exposure is relentless because it can be copied and pasted into the memory of a place forever. Derek, who had always relied on charm and social inertia, found himself boxed by receipts and public memory. He called me in the night, voice raw. "This ruins everything." And I heard in him not only fear but surprise that the tools he'd assumed were his image, influence, the unexamined deference of our neighbors, could be nullified by paper and sound and an honest reporter. I felt no joy in his fear. What I felt was a precise, cold clarity about leverage, about how family myths collapse under the small weight of documentation. Hannah watched the town talk itself into a new opinion, and in the kitchen at midnight she made me coffee that tasted like the old chipped blue mug, because rituals are stubborn. We sat at the table, and I told her I wasn't doing this to hurt, only to reclaim, and she said, "Then don't destroy them." That plea sliced through the plan like light through glass, and I realized my desire for justice had to be measured against what I still loved, my daughter's memory of her grandparents. I called Olivia and asked for a pause on follow-up pieces. She understood and agreed to give them a window to address the note with dignity. But the window closed quickly. Derek's employer put him on leave pending an internal review. Evelyn's social calendar emptied as invitations were rescinded, and the promissory note became, in the vernacular of a small town, proof that they had assumed my role without naming me. The tightness of the noose felt clinical now. The law had a way of taking away the social oxygen that privilege once breathed, and I watched as the world recalibrated its admiration. Yet even as the public turned, a private current ran under everything my mother called that night. Voice brittle, and said, "This isn't how we raised you, Mark." And the grief in it was sharp because it was disappointment thinly veneered in righteousness. I told her I would discuss settlement, but not humiliation. She hung up faster than I expected, like a blind person cutting the cord of a phone in panic. Outside, the porch light clicked off and on with the town's electricity, and I felt the rhythm of escalation building as if the whole story were a machine winding itself toward something irreversible. Then my phone pinged. An anonymous account had posted a video with the hashtag that made it easy to click to the article and the banter attached. Someone had stitched Evelyn's laugh to footage of Derek at work, and it had already hit the 10,000 view mark. We had forced a small town to watch itself in the mirror, and what it saw made people uncomfortable. The next morning, Derek's lawyer invited me to mediate. At the same time, an unknown envelope arrived at my door with a single Polaroid. Hannah, age 8, at a family picnic, smiling between Derek and our mother, the chipped blue mug visible on the blanket like an accusation. The photo smelled faintly of sun and old paper, and as I held it, I realized the weapon I had used had also broken a frame that held a child's memory. The balance of justice was suddenly a personal calculus. I folded the Polaroid, put it with the promissory note, and answered Derek's lawyer with a single sentence. "We can mediate on the terms of restitution and a public apology. Otherwise, we proceed." He wrote back, "We want to avoid court." The negotiation had opened, and the town watched by its screens. And yet, even as the procedural machinery did its quiet, grinding work, someone in the undercurrent of the family pushed back in a way I hadn't anticipated, and a new variable entered the game when my brother showed up at the mediation with a conciliatory smile and a manila envelope that smelled faintly of cigar smoke and old money, as if he borrowed someone else's calm and was wearing it like a suit. The mediator's table was small, the paper thin, and the fluorescent light made everyone's faces sharp and a little guilty. Derek arrived with a lawyer who smelled of expensive coffee and said things that were meant to soothe, but that always read to me like a draft of someone's damage control statement. He slid the envelope across and said, "We brought a token of good faith." And inside was a check that could have paid a month's mortgage, and a sheet of talking points that read like a script for a family commercial. I kept my hands folded and let him lay out the numbers, a sum that was neat and performative and designed to buy silence. Behind his offer was the old assumption that money could erase the memory of years of carrying the family's back, and I felt the old desire to accept because debtors accept anything that appears to quiet the storm. But I had learned that storms have an appetite for complacency, and this one had teeth. I told him I was willing to accept mediation, but only under strict public terms. A written apology circulated in the same channels where the disparagement had first spread, restitution that reflected interest and inconvenience, and a clear, enforceable statement acknowledging the promissory note and the clause about public comments. Derek nodded as if he'd expected these requests. His lawyer objected with the practiced dryness of someone trained to turn moral accountability into negotiation points. "We prefer privacy," the lawyer said, nose tilted like a judge's. "We want to protect the family." There was an audience in that line. Everyone loves the illusion of privacy when they expect privilege to save them, but privacy was precisely the cushion they'd used for decades. I watched the mediator make notes and thought of the mug sitting in the attic box like a quiet witness. At the settlement table, my hand was steady. I put my terms plainly, and then, when they hesitated, I pulled a small, surgical maneuver. I asked that all communications related to the settlement be sent to Carla's office and be carbon copied to Olivia. The pause in the room was audible. Derek's shoulders flexed, that tiny amount people show when they realize a public narrative can be guided but not fully contained. Carla's inclusion had two effects. It legitimized the legal path in a way that made a private hush money check look like an admission rather than a solution, and it ensured that any attempt to rewrite history would be traceable. "If this goes poorly," I said into the small conference room, "we will have an accurate, documented trail." Olivia watched with a sort of quiet curiosity that felt like a camera pointed at the heart. I wore ordinary clothes, work shirt, jeans, the hands of a man who measures himself in hours, but every detail here mattered because small details are often the hinges on which reputations swing. Derek sighed and said, "We can agree to a statement," and the mediator wrote fast, his pen scuffing the paper like an accomplice. I could feel the net tightening in the way a knot tightens. Each signed line narrowed their options. The next move was procedural and, in its way, elegant. I had Carla draft a settlement that made good on what the promissory note had called for, and that included a narrow, specific public apology clause. Crucially, the apology had to be posted in 3 places: the local paper, the church bulletin, and a pinned post on Evelyn's social feed for 30 days. The clause also set a defined schedule for restitution payments and included one technicality most people would skim over: a penalty for known compliance, calculated daily and payable to a local charity of my choosing, so that inaction would immediately translate into socially visible consequences. Contracts are arithmetic. They punish inertia. Derek's team countered with the usual diplomatic dance, and they tried to add a confidentiality rider that would forbid either party from discussing the settlement beyond close friends and family, which is exactly the kind of language that keeps cycles in motion. I refused. "No confidentiality," I said. "If you want the town to forget, give it a reason to forgive." The lawyer tried to make this about dignity. I turned it into a matter of record. Signing the settlement would be an act recorded in law, and then visible in the places where the original wound was delivered. It would either be a genuine apology or a public admission that they'd been wrong. Meanwhile, on the digital front, a new skirmish unfurled. Some anonymous account began to drip private chat screenshots that suggested Evelyn had, in other contexts, made disparaging remarks about my role in the family finances. The screenshots were raw screen grabs of messages to neighbors calling me an annoyance, and their spread made the town's gossip into evidence. Digital exposure is a kind of weather. It arrives in waves, warms the shore, and then leaves change behind. Derek's camp accused me of orchestrating the leaks. He posted on his feed that his brother had weaponized family pain. The accusation was hollow because his own messages had been public. And because I had been careful documenting, forwarding, CCING, the accusation had no purchase. But the leaks had created a higher stakes environment. Now the mediation was not simply between family members but between narratives, and people were choosing sides. I kept my face flat. A man who learns to trade on small things learns how to let the small things accumulate into leverage. Carla's drafts were precise. Timelines, signatures, the penalty formula tied to a bank account so transfers would be automatic if the apology did not post. The mechanics were meant to strip away ambiguity. They agreed in principle and signed a provisional memorandum that afternoon, shaking hands in that awkward way people do when they want the world to think something healed even when nothing has. But the new variable, something I had not entirely foreseen, was Evelyn's faith community starting to fracture in public. A longtime church member called the pastor and asked whether a family who publicly mocked one of their own could be supported by the congregation. The pastor, who had watched Evelyn host bake sales and lead the choir, hesitated, and the hesitance was contagious. Derek's coaching commitments were placed on hold as parents told the soccer board they were reconsidering, and the charity galas where they had been the golden faces began to send curt emails. Reputation, it turned out, is a fragile scaffolding. The pressure mounted, and Derek's demeanor changed from disdain to something like panic. He began to text more desperately, and once, late at night, he sent a string of messages that looked to me like the flailing of someone who had always expected the world to be malleable to his charm. He offered to double the settlement, to issue a heartfelt apology video, to step down from public roles, all in a series of short, clipped messages that smelled like concession. I read them and felt the old ache of watching someone reach for repair too late. I responded with the terms and waited. At the same time, someone, an old friend of Evelyn's who disliked how the family had always been performative, leaked a voicemail in which Evelyn admitted, in an intimate voice, that Mark had always been the one who saved us, followed by a brittle laugh that sounded like regret. The voicemail was a different animal. It sounded like confession but read like betrayal because tone can imprint guilt more clearly than words. That clip complicated public sentiment. The people who had been leaning one way began to shift, and the town's chorus of opinion splintered. Inside me, the shift made a hollow thrum of bitter satisfaction and unexpected sadness. Satisfaction that the ledger was speaking, sadness that confinement and public humiliation had become the method for truth. Then Derek's team delivered a twist I had to account for. They claimed that some of the evidence, one particularly damning screenshot, was doctored, and they hired a private forensic analyst to examine the metadata of the image files. For a moment, the playbook I had relied upon, the mix of digital exposure and contract, was threatened because if the screenshots could be convincingly contested, the whole public pressure could evaporate. I felt the old, precise fear. Legal arguments can be trivialized by plausible deniability. Carla moved quickly. She subpoenaed server logs and asked Olivia to preserve backups of the hosting site. Olivia, who had been both cautious journalist and moral instrument in this process, called me and said, "We need to make sure nothing can be deleted." The tension ratcheted then into a different register. Paper and pixels both became battlegrounds. I began to think like someone building a case. Every chat was forwarded, every bank transfer printed and double backed up, every voicemail archived in at least 3 formats. The methodical accumulation of evidence felt almost antiseptic, like applying iodine to a wound to keep it from festering, but there was also an ache in it, the realization that you must sometimes sterilize memory to preserve truth. For days the town watched the negotiation like a sport. Men I had worked with on crews sent short, supportive messages that tasted like loyalty. Neighbors called to say they'd read Olivia's piece and thanked me for standing up, but other voices in town called me petty or cruel. The moral calculus of revenge is a ledger too. People weigh the sums differently. The day before the settlement deadline, Derek's lawyer asked for a delay, citing newly discovered information that required further vetting. The phrase was a legal dance designed to stall. It smelled of a last-minute attempt to buy time and sympathy. I had anticipated stalling, so I had prepared a contingency, an automatic upload scheduled to post verified evidence to a secure public repository that would make tampering obvious, time to trigger if the apology did not appear by midnight. It was a small technicality, a code I'd had a friend in tech stand by to activate simple, brutal. If the clause was not fulfilled by the deadline, the evidence would become indisputably public, in a place where it could not be altered. I felt a surging, complicated thing when I flipped that switch. Fear of escalation, the sting of resolve, a sobered hope that this would finally close the loop. There was something mechanical about justice here, the way a gear slips into place. Click, the public record would be complete. But as the clock crept toward midnight and the town's lights blurred into a line of sleepy constellations, I realized that even the most elegant technicality carries consequences no lawbook can account for. Memories altered, relationships eroded, a daughter's picture folded into an argument. I sat at the table with the promissory note and the Polaroid of Hannah, and the weight of the choice I had made felt like lead in my chest. Then, with 20 minutes left, my phone buzzed, a text from Derek that began, "We need to talk face to face." The mediation had worked in one way, the pressure had made them come to the table. But the endgame was still unwritten, and I had built my trap to be fair in form but unforgiving in result. The trap would either catch the arrogance that had fed on my labor or snap closed on the fragile remains of a family. and I had to decide, in real time, whether the balance I sought would look more like justice or something colder. The next move would be theirs, and the thing I'd set into motion digital, contractual, communal hummed like a live wire, waiting to see who would make the next mistake. I realized the mistake they'd already made was believing that history could be managed by charm instead of signatures. And when Derek asked to meet at the diner on Route 71, the next morning I felt the same surge of calibration I get before I step onto an unstable ladder necessary risk-measured breath. He arrived with his face thinner than I'd ever seen it, and his hands trying to look steady on the formica table where the waitress slid coffee that steamed like a small white flag. He didn't try to smile. Instead, he opened the conversation with the hollow of someone bargaining with the truth. "We can fix this," he said, voice low. "We can make it so the town moves on." He meant payments and a private handshake. He meant buying the silence the ledger requested. I told him calmly that I had already set the terms. A public apology posted in the same places that had spread the insult, restitution into an account that would autopay to a charity if they missed a deadline, and the return of the chipped blue mug to me as a public symbol of acknowledgement. If they could not look the thing that had stood for my labor in the face, they could not mean their words. Derek's breath hitched when I said, "mug." The object had been small in our shared life, but huge in what it represented. He looked at the cup of coffee in front of him like it might reveal some hidden ledger of its own. "You want the mug?" he asked, incredulous, as if asking for it might be asking for his own public humiliation. I nodded. For months I'd kept that piece because it had been the one ordinary thing their eyes never really saw, the residue of mornings they'd never risen for. Asking for it back was not spite so much as a demand that a small, private relic be recognized in public as evidence of the work I'd done. Derek reached for his phone, and the talk slipped into numbers, lawyers, and schedules safe talk for someone desperate to keep his name from rotting on his resume. I could see, in his half-lidded gestures, the old presumption that if you purchased enough silence, you could purchase forgiveness. He offered an inflated settlement to avoid the apology clause. He offered a filmed, scripted apology that his PR person would vet. I shook my head. "Public unedited," I said. "Posted in full where the first hurt was public." He swallowed and agreed, finally, because the other option, letting the automatic repository we had on standby go live, would leave nothing for him to control. I had set that repository up with Olivia and a small tech friend, a lockbox that would publish every verified file, emails, audio, screenshots at midnight if the apology did not appear. It was a simple mechanical justice. Violate the clause, the machine publishes. Derek signed the provisional memorandum while the diner hummed around us with the ordinary business of other families, and when he pushed the chipped blue mug across the table, later that week wrapped in a napkin, like a premature relic, I felt an odd, complicated relief. The cup was warm from his hand, polished, but with the same faint ring of coffee inside. He said, "I hope this shows we're trying," and the gesture landed like an improvised piece offering an award he'd helped start. The publication deadline passed without the full apology appearing in the required places. Derek's peer-crafted video was polite but circumscribed, and it omitted the part about public disparagement in explicit terms. The automatic upload triggered. The repository we had armed with Olivia and Carla sprang open. The scam promissory note, the banquet audio with Evelyn's laugh, the screenshots, and a short clip of my mother on a cable call admitting, in a voicemail she thought private, that Mark had always been the one to save us, followed by a brittle laugh. The files were posted to a secure, official server that time-stamped each item and sent copies to local news feeds and to Derek's employer and the church board. It was impossible now to claim anything had been doctored without explaining why metadata matched the original files. The technicality we'd built, an automated filing tied to a clear contractual deadline, was procedural justice in its cleanest form. Known compliance translated to immediate public record. The town's reaction was quick and precise. Derek's employer suspended him pending investigation because corporations fear reputational risk. 2 gala sponsors rescinded invitations. The church organizing committee issued a statement that they were concerned about recent disclosures and would convene a review. Evelyn went silent then, her posts deleted and her social calendar emptied, while neighbors who had once dropped casseroles now texted with cold civility. Social exposure did the rest. The audio clip made a loop on local feeds. The voicemail circulated with captions, and the promissory note's scanned signature blew apart the mythology they'd used to live behind. There was a cascade of small, inexorable losses. Derek was asked to step down from coaching. A charity board returned funds that had his family name on event materials. Sponsors exchanged Derek Bennett for vague benefactor credits in old press releases. It was not theatrical revenge. It was the administrative and social consequence of documented actions, a humiliation composed of canceled meetings, clipped references, and a vacuum where entitlement once warmed a room. The one procedural twist that finally undid Derek came when his HR department discovered a pattern of expense reimbursements tied to event appearances that did not match his official calendar. Carla had included the bank transfers in our legal package, and accountancy logic dry, patient, inevitable found an inconsistency that breached company policy. It was a small technicality expense policy violations that did what charm could not. It gave HR the concrete reason to sever ties. He lost the job not because of the roast laugh at the banquet, but because paperwork, in the end, is less forgiving than gossip. The same arithmetic applied to Evelyn's standing. Organizations that once placed her on panels found it cleaner to distance, and she was left, bewildered and furious, to pick through invitations in a mailbox that suddenly meant less. The fall was procedural and public and therefore impossible to romanticize. Watching them unravel triggered an unexpected ache in me. Not for myself, but for the shapes of memory that were bending. Hannah's childhood photos had become evidence, and that hurt in a way the ledger never could calculate. There was a moment when Evelyn, frantic and public, tried to salvage reputation by posting a filmed apology in which she held the chipped blue mug and read from a prepared script. The sight was grotesque and small, her hands shaking as she attempted contrition from a script, but the public read it as coerced, and the apology failed to quiet the facts. The mug, which had once been an invisible witness to my labor, had been returned to the only place that mattered now: public view. Its presence in her hands in that apology was the poetic justice I'd required, and it landed as proof that symbols can outlive the people who wield them. There is a certain clarity to watching the thing you've kept for years become the instrument that forces recognition. It was not joy, but a cold, sharp settlement of accounts. In the end, Derek offered everything the memorandum demanded. The apology was posted, restitution payments began to flow into the account with the automatic penalty clause, and he signed away some public roles. Legally, we had closed the loop. Practically, the town had rearranged itself, but procedural justice does not erase scars. The public exposure meant that my daughter's place in the family photograph had been used in court for leverage. The Polaroid of Hannah smiling between us was folded into emails, and the image of her innocence had to be explained to strangers. I sat with that reality in the quiet aftermath and felt the cost of making private ruptures public. After the settlement, there was a slow, awkward rebuilding. Derek called one evening with a voice that had sharpened into something like contrition. "I'm sorry," he said plainly, without the performative charm. It felt small and honest, and I answered back with the only thing that had ever felt right. "I want you to mean it more than you say it." He promised to volunteer quietly, to step away from roles that put his ego on podiums, and he began therapy because sometimes the work that matters is the tedious work of being present without performance. My mother left a voicemail that weekend with a voice that had lost its earlier armor. She admitted she had been cruel and asked for a meeting. I agreed to see her, but told her it would be on neutral ground, and not in front of Hannah, because the last thing I wanted was for my daughter to be caught in the middle again. The public unmaking of them did not make my hurt vanish. Those pains are stubborn, like calluses, but it redistributed power in a way that had been overdue. I gave the chipped blue mug to Hannah after the dust settled. I wrapped it in the same napkin Derek had used, and on a Sunday morning she held it over the kitchen table while sunlight striped across the wood. "It's our story now," I told her, and she nodded. There was no vindictive flourish in that handing over, only the clarity that a symbol's meaning can be retaken and repurposed for the living. One quotable truth came to me then, simple and earned. Contracts don't forgive. They only make the world remember the promises you thought were private. The line landed between us like a small, honest bone. We used some of the restitution to start a small community fund for kids whose parents worked second jobs, practical, boring charity that made sense of the penalty payments and gave restitution visible purpose. It felt like a proper accounting to put the town's gaze to work, making the consequence of pride into fuel for others' safety nets. People in town still talked, and some still called me cruel. Revenge always carries a cost visible to someone. But the measurable things had changed. Derek's public roles were gone. His income had a different contour. My parents had to rearrange their social calendars around a new humility, and most of all, the ledger of our family life now had receipts others could read. I carried scars, emotional and social, that punished some nights with grief and private second-guessing. Yet I also carried a new space of autonomy that felt like a rib newly mended. I no longer paid to keep a myth afloat. Walking away from the public aftermath, I kept my routine truck, dusty gloves, contractor's phone buzzing with real work, and I learned two plain things that fit in two sentences. People will use kindness as a bill if you let them. Keep your receipts. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It helps us share more true stories like this.